That winter night in northern New Mexico didn't feel like a fairy tale. It felt sharp and real. Wind scraping along the stucco walls, sand and ice carried together on the same breath. Inside a small adobe house on the edge of the Santa Fe National Forest, a woman named Clara Monroe thought it would be just another quiet evening with her old cat. She had no idea that before midnight, a pregnant bobcat would collapse on her front step, begging for help, and that her house cat's reaction would leave her absolutely speechless. The storm had rolled in early, the way desert storms sometimes do, not with drama at first, but with a slow thickening of the air. The TV in the corner had been warning all day about record lows and dangerous wind chills in the high country. Clara muted it after the third repeat. She didn't need anyone to tell her how cold it was getting. She could feel it in her joints. She moved the way people who've worked hard all their lives move. Steady, a little stiff. She poured herself a mug of coffee, added a splash of the good cream, and watched the sky change through the kitchen window as daylight slipped away. The pinon and scrub out back blurred into a gray smudge behind the swirling snow. Out there, the land dropped into a narrow arroyo, then rose again toward the dark line of forest. Inside, the house was simple and warm. A small fire snapped in the kiva fireplace. The ticking of a wall clock filled the pauses where conversation used to be. On the sofa, her black and white cat Milo lay curled like a comma, his half-torn ear flicking now and then at the sound of the wind. If you've ever lived alone for a while, you know how loud quiet can be. Clara knew that quite well. She had come to this place after too many long nights in an emergency wildlife clinic. After one sudden phone call that changed everything, after losing more than she could carry in her chest. Out here, there were no beeping monitors, no ringing phones, just desert, sky, and one loyal cat who seemed content to share whatever was left of her days. She told herself she was done with chaos, done with emergencies, done with heartbreak. The snow thickened as the evening wore on. Milo woke, stretched, and padded over to the front window. He liked to sit there, paws neatly tucked, watching whatever moved. A rabbit, a neighbor's truck, a stray tumbleweed. Tonight, though, there was nothing to see, just snowflakes catching the porch light, spinning in tight circles like tired dancers. Clara turned back to her desk, where a half-finished chapter stared back at her from the laptop screen. Something about predator conservation in the Southwest. Facts, numbers, habitat ranges. Important, but dry. She typed a sentence, deleted it, typed another. Her mind kept drifting to the sound of the wind and the ache in her hands. Then she heard it. At first, it was easy to dismiss as one more noise in an old house. A faint scuff, a dull thump somewhere near the door. Old wood settles. Branches knock. She ignored it. The sound came again, a slow, dragging scrape. Milo's head turned sharply toward the door, his golden eyes narrowed, not in fear, but in focus. Clara froze, listening. The wind howled along the eaves, rattled the glass, and beneath it, there it was again. A sound that didn't belong to the house or the storm. Something alive. Something struggling. She set her mug down and stood up, feeling that familiar old conflict rise in her chest. The part of her that had spent years running toward trouble, and the part that had moved out here to finally run away from it. "Milo, you hearing that too?" she murmured. The cat answered by hopping down from the window and padding slowly toward the front door. No puffed tail, no arched back. Just that quiet, deliberate walk, as if he had been expecting a visitor. Another scrape, a soft, almost desperate thud. Clara's training kicked in. Bears weren't common here, not like in other parts of the West, but coyotes were, mountain lions occasionally, and sometimes hungry animals got bold when the world went white and cold. She reached up to the high shelf by the doorway and took down the old shotgun. It wasn't loaded to harm, just to scare her if she needed it. Still, its weight felt serious in her hands. She clicked on the porch light. Yellow glow spilled across the small entryway. Through the peephole, she saw nothing but a whirling sheet of snow. No outline of a body, no movement, just white. A lot of people in that moment might have turned the deadbolt and walked away, and honestly, no one would blame them. But then Milo did something that didn't make any sense. He walked up to the door and sat down with his nose almost touching the wood. His body relaxed, tail lay out loosely behind him. He looked over his shoulder at Clara and blinked. Slow, calm. The kind of blink you see when a cat is saying in its own language, "It's okay. I trust this." That small gesture pierced through the wall she'd built around herself more than any sound on the other side of the door. Clara took a breath. "All right," she whispered, mostly to herself. "We'll just take a look." She eased the lock, cracked the door only an inch. A rush of cold hit her face, sharp enough to sting. The porch light cut a pale tunnel through the storm, and first she saw only snow and the shadow of the railing. Then she looked down. Cradled against the base of the door, half buried in drifting snow, was a bobcat. Her fur was matted with ice, her ears pinned back. Muscles that should have been lean and strong trembled under a coat that had lost its shine. And there, unmistakable even in the half-light, was the swollen curve of her belly, heavily pregnant. In a storm that could kill a healthy animal overnight, her breathing came in ragged pulls. With each breath, her sides rose and fell hard, almost too hard. She lifted her head when the door opened, eyes catching the light. Golden, wild, and full of something that shouldn't belong in a predator's gaze. Not a threat, not a challenge, just a kind of exhausted plea. You don't need to believe animals feel human emotions to see it. Sometimes it's simply there, and it's impossible to ignore. For a moment, Clara, Milo, and the bobcat stayed exactly where they were, connected by nothing but a cold strip of air and a thin line of light. Snowflakes melted on the threshold. The world shrank down to those 3 beating hearts. "This is not happening," Clara breathed. Milo slipped forward into that narrow gap before she could stop him. His whiskers brushed the cold air, and he looked straight at the wildcat. No hiss, no fear. He gave that same slow, trusting blink, and something in the bobcat's posture softened. In that instant, this stopped being just a story about a wild animal and a storm. It became one of those heartwarming stories that hinted something bigger, the strange loyalty and kindness that can move between species when survival, love, and sheer need all collide at the same doorway. Clara knew every guideline that said what she should do next. Call wildlife officials, keep her distance, stay safe. But she also knew what it felt like to be on the other side of a door, hoping someone would open it. Loss, grief, burnout. They had pushed her out here. Yet seeing that wild mother's emotions written in every trembling muscle, hearing the wind howl behind her, it was as if life was quietly asking Clara if she was truly finished caring. If you've ever stood at your own kind of door, the narrator might say here, wondering if your heart can handle opening it again, you already understand more of Clara's story than you think. She tightened her hand on the doorknob, loosened her grip on the shotgun, and opened the door a little wider. "Okay," she whispered, "just for tonight." What happened after that, how Bramble the bobcat crossed into the warmth, and how Milo became the calm center of a situation that would have terrified most animals, is where this inspirational story truly begins. Before we go there, take a breath with Clara. Feel the cold at your ankles, the warmth at your back, and that one impossible choice hovering between fear and compassion. If moments like this speak to you, where wildness and home touch for just a second, stay with us. In the next part, we'll step inside that little house, see the life Clara thought she wanted, and why this knock at the door arrived at exactly the right time. Before a pregnant bobcat ever touched her doorstep, Clara had built a life where nothing unexpected was supposed to happen. No midnight calls, no flashing lights, no blood on stainless steel. Just a small house, one old cat, and a long stretch of quiet days that all looked almost the same. It wasn't a bad life, but it wasn't quite a happy one either. Most mornings in northern New Mexico started the same way for Clara. The sky would still be dark when she shuffled into the kitchen, feet in worn slippers, hand reaching for the coffee tin without even looking. The heating would hum to life, popping gently in the vents. Outside the window, the outline of piñon trees sat black against a slowly lightening horizon. Milo always arrived first. Before the kettle boiled, before the toast popped, he'd be there, hopping up onto the same chair by the window, tail curling around his paws, watching for the first hint of daylight in the arroyo out back. Clara would talk to him the way people do when they've lived with an animal long enough to forget they're technically not supposed to understand. "Well, we made it through another night," she'd say softly. "Not bad for a couple of strays." She didn't mean it literally, but it wasn't exactly a joke either. Her days were simple. A walk along the dirt road when the wind allowed it, a list of chores on the fridge, a couple of phone calls she mostly let go to voicemail. The biggest part of her routine sat on that small wooden desk by the living room window. A laptop full of chapters about North American predators. She was writing about animals she once met in the most intense moments of their lives. Injured coyotes, stunned hawks, the occasional frightened bobcat. But now she described them in careful, measured lines. Range, diet, threats, numbers. The work had meaning, at least on paper. The work did not ask her to stay up all night, begging a heartbeat to steady. It did not ask her to call her husband and say, "We tried everything." It did not ask her to live through that last night in the clinic again. If you've ever stepped away from a job or a role that took everything out of you, you might understand why the quiet felt like safety at first. Clara told herself she was choosing peace, choosing healing. And in some ways, she was. But there was another part of the story, the why behind that quiet life, that she tried not to look at too closely. Before the desert, there was a brightly lit emergency room for wildlife on the edge of a big city. For years, Clara lived in a world of ringing phones, metal tables, and tired owners with hope written all over their faces. She saw love and loyalty every single day. The way people would drive 2 hours just to bring in a hawk they found on the side of the road, or sit on a hard bench all night for a feral cat that didn't even have a name. She also saw how often kindness wasn't enough to save a life. One night, in particular, carved a deep scar she didn't show to many people. A young coyote had been hit on the highway, legs shattered, lungs bruised. They worked on him for hours, fluids, oxygen, careful hands. Outside, the city lights glowed like a curtain. In the middle of that chaos, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She almost ignored it. Work first, always. But something made her glance down. It was the hospital. Her husband's name is on the caller ID. By sunrise, she had lost both. The animal on the table, and the person waiting for her at home. Grief doesn't always show up with big gestures. Sometimes it whispers, "You can't do this anymore," and you listen. A few months later, Clara turned in her badge, sold the house they'd shared, and drove north until the landscape felt empty enough to match the inside of her chest. The adobe house on the edge of the national forest looked like a quiet fairy tale for a woman who had seen too much. Thick walls, wood beams, a small fenced yard, a good lock on the door. She told herself this would be a gentle chapter. She would write her book, feed her cat, and let the rest of the world take care of itself. Milo entered the story on a day when she thought she was just dropping off blankets at the local shelter. The building smelled of disinfectant and worry. Dogs barked, then stopped, then started again. She could have left the bag at the front desk and walked away. That was the plan. Instead, she found herself drifting down the row of cat cages. There were playful ones, reaching through the bars with eager paws. There were shy ones, pressed into the corners. And then there was one small black and white cat sitting quietly, just watching. His ear was torn, healed crooked. His eyes were steady. He didn't meow. He didn't reach. He just looked at her as if to say, "I know what it feels like to lose everything familiar." Of course, he didn't actually say that. But when you're carrying a heart full of unsaid things, Sometimes it takes very little to feel seen. She signed a quiet presence, a gentle sort of love that didn't ask too many questions. In the months that followed, Milo became the one consistent thread that tied her days together. When the loneliness pressed in too tightly, his purring grounded her. To someone watching from the outside, these might look like small moments, but for someone trying to hold themselves together in midlife, after losses, after change, those small moments are the ones that keep the floor from giving way. So when you think of Clara's quiet life, don't picture a failure or a retreat. Picture a woman doing what many of us do after heartbreak, building a smaller, safer world, brick by careful brick, limiting the amount of emotion she has to feel at once. Choosing a life where the biggest surprise is a neighbor dropping off fresh eggs. There's a certain kindness to that too, to yourself. Sometimes stepping back is the only way to keep going at all. But there's also a risk. If you play things too safe for too long, the heart can start to close up in ways that don't heal, just harden. The same walls that keep pain out keep soulful, unexpected joy out too. It becomes easy to say, I'm just not that needed anymore, and let the days pass like pages in a book you're not really reading. That's where we find Clara on that winter evening. A woman who has seen more than her share of loss, who has built a life where nothing wild crosses the threshold unless she invites it. A woman who, deep down, still has a river of love and loyalty running through her, but has learned to keep it buried. Until that storm, until that scraping at the door, until a wild mother, close to collapsing, chose her house out of all the houses on that long, cold road. If you recognize pieces of yourself in Clara, in the routines, the quiet, the careful distance from anything that might hurt again, it's okay. Many of us arrive at midlife carrying more than we ever thought we could. This isn't a moral story telling you you've done it wrong. It's a heartwarming story about what can happen when life gently invites us to open the door just a little wider. In the next part, we'll step back into that freezing night and watch how Clara's carefully controlled life collides with Bramble's desperate need, and how Milo, the ordinary house cat, becomes the calm center of something almost unbelievable. If these slower, thoughtful, inspirational stories about people and animals help you feel a little less alone, you're welcome to stay with Clara, Milo, and Bramble for the rest of this journey. This one was made with hearts like yours in mind. On one side of the door, there was everything Clara thought she understood. 4 walls, a fire, and a quiet life she could control. On the other side, there was a storm, a wild mother on the edge of collapse, and a choice she had sworn she would never have to make again. The cold poured in through the narrow gap as Clara eased the door open. It wrapped around her ankles, sharp enough to steal her breath for a second. The porch light carved out a small circle of gold against the swirling white, and in that circle, she saw her. The bobcat lay pressed against the threshold, as if she had run out of road right there on Clara's welcome mat. Snow clung to her whiskers. Her sides heaved with each breath, lifting and falling under a belly that was far too round for a night like this. Clara's vet mind registered it first. Too thin, too late in pregnancy. Wrong season, wrong place. But another part of her, the part that had spent years reading fear and pain in animal eyes, saw something else. A kind of stunned, exhausted plea. There was still wildness there. Still a spark that said, I am not tame, but it flickered under layers of cold, hunger, and something like trust, desperation. Whatever word you choose, it lived in that long look she gave Clara. You don't see that in field guides. You see it when life and death push up against each other at 3 a.m. Milo stood shoulder to shoulder with Clara, just inside the doorway. Any other house cat might have bolted under the bed or puffed up all hiss and bravado. Instead, he seemed strangely calm. He studied the bobcat the way cats do, taking in scent, posture, the way her ears moved. Then, very gently, Milo did the one thing that changed everything. He lowered his head and gave her a slow blink. If you've lived with cats, you might know that look. It's their version of, "I don't mean you harm," a tiny gesture of kindness and trust. For a wild bobcat in a blizzard, it was an invitation into another world. Clara's hand tightened on the doorframe. All her training rose up like a wall of rules between her and that threshold. Wild predators don't come inside. You don't bring a bobcat into a small house. You called wildlife officers. You keep your distance. She could recite the protocol in her sleep, but then the wind shoved a new gust of snow across the porch. It hit the bobcat's exposed side, and the animal flinched, curling slightly around her belly as if trying to shield the lives inside her. A soft, raw sound escaped her. Not a growl, not quite a cry, just air forced through a body that was almost out of strength. The scar along her flank caught the porch light. Clara squinted, leaning a hair closer. That wasn't from tonight. It wasn't from this storm. It was an old injury, healed but not forgotten. A thin, pale line that spoke of wire or steel, of a trap that had once closed around this body and then opened again. In that faint, white line, Clara read a story. This bobcat had already met the human world and survived it. Maybe someone had cut her free once. Maybe she had learned that sometimes hands hurt, and sometimes they help. The questions came fans. Had drought pushed her this far down from the high ridges? Had new houses cut into her hunting ground, forcing her to roam farther, hungrier, heavier with each day of this difficult pregnancy? The answers didn't change the one fact pulsing in front of her. A wild mother, on the very edge of her strength, had chosen this door. Why this one? Why her house on this hill with this cat? Clara looked at Milo again. He hadn't moved. He just sat there, tail resting on the tile, eyes soft but steady on the bobcat. His calm wasn't showy. It was quiet, simple loyalty. To her, to this strange moment. He trusted something about this wild visitor. The question was whether Clara could trust herself. If you've ever had a moment where your head and your heart pulled in opposite directions, you know what that doorway felt like. Her head said, "If you let her in, you're crossing a line you can't uncross. You might get hurt. You might fail. You might care too much." Her heart said nothing at all. It just remembered long nights in the clinic, remembered the strange peace of being needed, remembered how it felt to stand between pain and relief and say, "I'm here. I'll try." The shotgun in her hand suddenly felt wrong. She leaned it carefully back against the wall. Her fingers were trembling. From cold, yes, but also from the weight of the decision. "Okay," she whispered, more to Milo and herself than to the bobcat.
"Okay, one step at a time."
She opened the door wider. For a moment, the bobcat didn't move. The wild has its own caution, its own boundaries. Her ears flicked, testing the air of the house, the smell of wood smoke and old coffee, the faint scent of Milo on the rugs. Storm behind her, warmth ahead of her. Every instinct was telling her both were dangerous in different ways. Then Milo stood up, not all the way, just enough to take 3 small steps forward, paws landing exactly on the wooden threshold. He turned his head, looked back at the bobcat, and blinked again, slow, deliberate. It was such a tiny act, but in that moment, it felt like watching one world reaching out to another, saying, "You're safe. Come on." The bobcat shifted. Paws uncurled from the snow. She tested her weight, shook once as if to shed the storm, and then, with a kind of weary dignity, she stepped over the threshold. Wild pause in a human doorway. A line crossed that rarely is. She moved carefully, hugging the wall, every muscle ready to bolt if the wrong thing happened. Her eyes never left Clara's face. Milo kept pace at a respectful distance, not trying to touch, just showing the path. Clara closed the door gently behind them, the latch clicking softly. The sound was almost ordinary, like any door being shut on any winter night. But inside, the whole shape of her life had changed. Bramble, though that name would only come later, found the farthest corner of the living room and pressed herself there, back against plaster, eyes sweeping the small space. The firelight painted shadows on her fur. Her side still rose and fell rapidly, but there was a new kind of tension in her body now. A watchfulness, sharpened by the sudden absence of the blizzard's roar. Milo settled down halfway between Clara and the wild mother, like a bridge laid quietly across a gap. He started to groom his shoulder, as if to demonstrate that, as strange as this was, it could still be normal, calm, almost happy in its own fragile way. This is where moral stories often rush in with big lessons, but real life usually moves more slowly. In that small house, nothing was resolved yet. No one knew what the night would bring. What we do see, though, is a woman who thought she was done with emergency rooms, standing in a new one, improvising rules as she goes. We see a wild bobcat daring to trust a species that had harmed her before. We see a house cat whose quiet courage becomes the most surprising part of this heartwarming story. If you've ever felt the pull between staying safe and opening your door to someone in need, you already understand the emotions swirling in that little room. The line between wild and home, between self-protection and kindness, is rarely clear. But moments like this are where soulful, inspirational stories are born. In the next part, we'll follow Clara as she turns a spare room into a den, and we'll be there as the first contractions start. We'll see how a retired vet, a weary bobcat, and an ordinary house cat work together to bring new life into the world. If you'd like to keep walking with them, and maybe revisit some of your own beliefs about fear, love, and who we let into our homes, stay with us. The night is just beginning. Life doesn't always begin the way we picture it. Sometimes it doesn't start in a forest hollow or a rocky den, but on a pile of borrowed blankets in a spare room that hasn't seen a guest in years, with a house cat standing guard over a wild bobcat mother trying to bring her kittens into the world. Once Bramble crossed the threshold, it didn't take Clara long to recognize the signs. The way Bramble's sides heaved. How could she not find a position that gave her relief? The soft, strained sounds slipped out when she thought no one was looking. Labor. It had been a long time since Clara had been the one responsible for guiding new life into the world. She'd done it in bright, sterile rooms with a team and machines and backup plans, not in a small adobe house with wind humming in the vents and a single lamp to push back the dark. But the body remembers. Her training rose up as it had just been waiting for this call. "All right, sweetheart," she murmured, keeping her voice low and steady, more for herself than the cat. "We need you somewhere quieter." The living room, with its drafty window and flickering TV, was no place for what was coming. So Clara did the only thing that made sense. She opened the door to the room she rarely used. The spare room smelled faintly of old books and sunlight trapped in curtains. A single bed, a nightstand, boxes along one wall. It had been meant for visitors who never arrived. Tonight, it would become a den. Clara moved with quiet purpose. She pulled the comforter off the bed, layered towels and blankets on the floor in a wide nest, dimmed the lamp until the light was soft and golden, placed a shallow bowl of water nearby. Every action had a rhythm to it, something she hadn't felt in years. The kind of rhythm that comes when you know exactly what to do, even if you wish you didn't have to. Her knees complained as she knelt to smooth the blankets. Her hands ached when she wrung out a warm cloth. Age and old injuries made themselves known, but for the first time in a while, she didn't resent them. They were proof of all the nights she'd already lived through, all the creatures she'd tried to help. In the living room, Bramble shifted again, muscles tightening in a new way. Milo stayed close, eyes moving between wild mother and human, as if checking that both were still there. "Come on," Clara said softly, standing in the hallway between them. "Let's show her." She didn't tug or push. That never works with fear. Instead, she let Milo go first. He walked down the hall with the unhurried dignity only a cat can pull off, tail held at a relaxed angle. He paused in the doorway of the spare room, looked over his shoulder at Bramble, and stepped inside. Once there, he hopped lightly onto the bed and settled, purring where she could see him from the floor. Bramble hesitated at the threshold. The scent in this room was different, more contained, less storm, and more human. She sniffed the air, ears flicking, body tight with instinct. And yet, the storm no longer roared in her ears. The light was gentle. The floor was soft. Her belly clenched again, sharp and deep, reminding her that time wasn't a luxury she had. Step by step, she moved into the room, circling once, twice, 3 times before lowering herself onto the nest Clara had prepared. Her breath came in short, controlled bursts now, her eyes narrowed in concentration. The wild was here, in this little room. No matter how many comforters you lay down, birth doesn't care about decor. It's raw, demanding, and ancient. Clara settled herself on the floor nearby, not too close, back against the wall. She spread her worn medical kit open beside her. Gloves, scissors, bulb syringe. She hoped she wouldn't need most of it.
Easy, she whispered. You do what you know how to do. I'll be here if you need help.
Milo jumped down from the bed, choosing the spot between them. He lay lengthwise, facing Bramble, tail tucked neatly around his paws. His purr started up again, low and steady. The kind of sound that seems to vibrate right into your bones, if you've ever had a cat curl up on your chest after a hard day. The first strong contraction hit, and Bramble's whole body bowed around it. A low growl rumbled from deep inside her, not a threat, but a sound pushed up from effort and emotion. Her claws flexed into the blankets. We'd threaten prickled to Clara's temples in sympathy. Time shifted into that strange, stretchy place it goes when something important is happening. Minutes felt like hours, but the clock on the nightstand told the truth in its small, practical way. Between contractions, there were glimpses of stillness. Clara's own thoughts drifted, uninvited, to the last time she was this close to a struggling mother, and how that night had ended with both an empty table and an empty side of the bed.
I said I was done with this,
she thought, not unkindly.
and here I am, on the floor again.
Hoping with everything I have that a tiny heart keeps beating. Maybe you know that feeling too. Swearing you're finished with caring because it hurts too much, and then finding yourself right back in it when someone vulnerable crosses your path. These are the moments moral stories and fairy tales try to capture. But in real life, they come with coffee-stained mugs and aching joints, and a cat hair or two on the blankets. The first kitten came with a rush, a small, slick bundle that slid into the world with a wet sound. Bramble turned immediately, instincts precise, beginning to lick away the membrane, rough tongue working with practiced urgency. The tiny body shuddered under her care, then let out a squeaky, indignant cry that made all 3 beings in the room exhale at once.
There you go.
Clara breathed, tears stinging her eyes.
There's one.
She stayed back, letting wild instincts lead. This wasn't a clinic. This was a mother who, despite everything, knew exactly what needed to happen. The second kitten didn't come as easily. Contractions grew more intense, more strained. Bramble's breath came faster, her growls edged with something like frustration. When Clara leaned forward just enough to see, her stomach dropped. Feet first. Breach. In a fully equipped facility, she would have had options. Sedation, extra hands, a surgeon on call. Here, there was just her, a scared, exhausted bobcat, and a house cat who seemed to sense the rising tension. Milo shifted closer to Bramble's head, purring louder now, as if trying to knit the air into something steady. His presence wasn't dramatic, it was just solid. Royalty wrapped in black and white fur.
Okay.
Clara whispered, sliding on a pair of gloves with practiced motions.
Okay, girl.
I'm going to help you, and then I'll back off, I promise. She moved slowly, narrating every inch. Not because Bramble understood the words, but because tone matters. Kindness has its own language. As she reached toward the struggling kitten, Bramble's eyes snapped to hers. For a heartbeat, wild and human locked in a fierce, shared fear. Bramble could have lashed out. Clara knew that. But she didn't. She held herself still in a way that must have cost her. Trust in its rawest form. With gentle, precise movements, Clara supported the tiny legs, eased the body into a better angle, and guided the kitten out. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't easy, but it was enough. The kitten lay still for a terrifying second. Clara cleared its mouth and nose, rubbed its chest with a fingertip, murmuring the kind of nonsense words people say in delivery rooms and barns and any place life teeters between staying and slipping away.
Come on, little one,
She pleaded.
this world needs you more than you know.
Then, a small movement, a gasp, a thin cry.
Bramble lunged forward, maternal instincts taking over, and Clara quickly placed the kitten within reach.
Wild tongue took over the work of warming and waking. Milo's purr dropped back to its steady hum. 2 more kittens came in the next hour, not easily, but without the same crisis. By the time the last one was cleaned and tucked against Bramble's belly, the room felt different. The air held the warm, milky smell of new life. The storm outside was still there, but muffled, distant, like a world they had all agreed to ignore for a little while. Clara leaned back against the wall, every muscle stiff, every emotion wide open. She watched Milo stretched out nearby, eyes half closed, watching over kittens that didn't share his blood, but now shared his space. This wasn't just a heartwarming story about a wild animal in trouble. It was a soulful, inspirational story about what happens when love and courage cross species lines. When a woman who thought she was finished finds out her capacity for kindness and care was not used up after all.
If you've ever sat beside a hospital bed, or a kennel, or even just on the floor next to a beloved pet in their hardest hour, you know that these quiet, intense moments stay with you. They change you. They remind you that even in pain, there can be something almost happy about being fully present for another life.
As dawn began to soften the edges of the room, Bramble dozed lightly, her body curved protectively around her kittens. Milo finally closed his eyes, purring them all into rest. Clara sat in the half-light, feeling both exhausted and strangely whole. In the next part, we'll step into the days that follow, how this unlikely family settles into a rhythm, how the house rearranges itself around 4 tiny bobcat kittens, and how Clara's quiet life begins to open, inch by inch. If moments like this speak to something in you, if they touch old memories of care, loss, loyalty, and the small miracles you've witnessed, you're welcome to stay with this little household a while longer. Their story has more to say. Most families don't begin with a blizzard and a shotgun in the hallway, but in that little adobe house after the storm passed, what stayed behind was something quieter, stranger, and far more tender than Clara ever expected. A wild bobcat mother, 4 newborn kittens, and 1 ordinary house cat who refused to act like any of this was unusual. The first morning after the birth, the world outside looked scrubbed clean. Snow glittered along the arroyo. The sky was a hard, bright blue, the way it gets in the southwest after a storm has emptied itself. Inside, the air in the spare room was heavy and warm, thick with the milky scent of new life. Clara eased the door open with the same care a person uses when stepping into a nursery. The lamp was dimmed, the blankets were rumpled. Bramble lay curled around her kittens, her spotted body forming a tight crescent of protection. And there, tucked just outside that circle, was Milo. He wasn't touching the kittens, not quite, but he had wedged himself close enough that his body heat slipped into the nest, his steady purr humming in the background like a low, familiar song. To anyone else, it might have looked like a strange little accident of timing. A wildcat and a house cat sharing the same room. To Clara, standing in the doorway with a hand on the frame, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like kindness, choosing to stay. Days began to fall into a new pattern. The alarm clock, once set for early writing hours, became irrelevant. Clara woke when Bramble stirred, or when one of the kittens let out a squeak that didn't sound quite right. She checked bellies, counted noses, and made sure everyone was warm enough. Her laptop, gathered a thin skin of dust.
The book on predator conservation she'd been working on sat open to the same paragraph for almost a week.
She'd read the sentence, "Bobcats are solitary by nature," 3 times, and found herself looking toward the spare room every single time, as if the words on the page might apologize for being so definitive.
"Solitary,"
she murmured one afternoon, listening to the soft chorus of purrs and tiny snuffles.
No one told you that, did they, Bramble?
Between feeds, she tidied the main rooms on autopilot, washed mugs, shook out rugs, put logs into the fireplace. Life went on, the way it always does. But the center of gravity in the house had shifted. Everything revolved around that small den at the end of the hall. Milo adjusted without protest. His food bowl moved from the corner of the kitchen to just outside the spare room. He began to split his days between his old window perch and his new post as unofficial uncle in the nursery. It was in the little things that their strange family showed itself. When Bramble stood to drink, one kitten always slid away from the warmth, confused and complaining. Milo would quietly move closer, settling so that his side took the place where her body had been, sharing his heat with the tiny spotted bundle, until Bramble returned. When Clara brought in a shallow dish of water, Bramble eyed it suspiciously at first. Milo would step forward, drink calmly, then step back as if to say, "See? It's safe." Bramble, watching him, would then lower her head to drink with a caution that softened a little each day. These weren't big, dramatic gestures. They weren't the stuff of loud headlines. But for anyone who values heartwarming stories and small miracles, these were the moments that mattered. If you've ever lived alone for a while, you might know how quickly your routines start to feel like walls. You do the same things in the same order because it's comforting and predictable. There's a certain safety in that, especially when you've been through loss. Bramble's arrival blew a gentle hole right through those walls. Clara found herself doing things she hadn't done in years, humming to herself as she folded towels, talking out loud to the air, explaining what she was doing as she mixed a little extra food for Bramble, as if the bobcat cared about the recipe. Saying "we" instead of "I" when she made plans for the day. "We'll check the fence this afternoon," she told Milo one morning. "Make sure nothing can sneak too close." He flicked an ear like he was logging it in his own quiet way. There was another change too, one she didn't say out loud. For the first time since her husband died, Clara caught herself feeling a kind of low, steady happiness that wasn't tied to anything dramatic. It wasn't the joy of good news or big events. It was something simpler. The contentment of a house that felt full again, not full of people, full of life. Of course, living between wild and home wasn't simple. Bramble was still a predator. There were moments when that truth sharpened, the way her pupils narrowed when an unfamiliar sound touched the window, how she positioned herself between the kittens and anyone who entered, muscles coiled and ready. Before bed, Clara sometimes stood at the window and imagined what Bramble's days had been like before the storm. Hunting rabbits along the ridge, listening for coyotes, avoiding the smell of human camps and trash. She'd trace the pale scar on Bramble's flank with her eyes, remembering that old trap wound. That thin line said a lot. This bobcat had been hurt by humans before, and yet, when she needed help the most, she'd come to a human door. It raised questions that didn't have easy answers. How do you honor a wild animal's nature while giving them what they clearly need? Where's the line between helping and taming? What does loyalty look like when two different worlds overlap like this? At the kitchen table, late at night, Clara would catch herself drawing little maps on notepads. The arroyo, the tree line, her house. Thinking about where Bramble might go when this was all over, and what would happen if the bobcat grew too attached to the comfort of human walls. These weren't just logistics. They were emotional questions too, the kind of questions people ask themselves when they take in a stray dog for just a few days, or when they feed a feral cat behind the grocery store and end up visiting every single night just to be sure it's okay. We don't always plan the bonds that change us. They just happen.
Outside, the world hadn't stopped because a bobcat gave birth in Clara's spare room. Within a week, the snow began to melt back into the thirsty soil. The arroyo was filled with a thin ribbon of water. Tracks appeared in the soft mud, deer, rabbits, something with smaller, sharper paws. One morning, on her walk around the property, Clara saw a set of prints along the fence line that made her pause. Coyote. She followed them with her eyes as they moved parallel to the house, close enough that if the windows had been open, Bramble might have scented them. The prints circled once, then veered away toward the open land. Something in Clara's chest tightened. She imagined those coyotes picking up the smell of milk, of vulnerability, of opportunity. The wild outside her walls was not a gentle place. It had never been. Back inside, she stood in the doorway of the spare room and watched Bramble sleep. Kittens tucked against her, like small, breathing stones. Milo glanced up, met Clara's gaze, and gave that slow, reassuring blink again. Living between wild and home meant holding both truths at once. This is beautiful, and this cannot last forever. If you've ever let someone in, a person, an animal, even a new habit, knowing deep down that it's temporary, you already recognize the mix of gratitude and impending ache that filled Clara's days. She cherished the small routines, the way one kitten always wiggled away from the pile and ended up sleeping on Bramble's paw, the tiny squeaks when they dreamed, Milo's ridiculous patience when a blind little paw batted at his tail. At the same time, a quiet part of her mind was already bracing for the moment when she'd have to let them go. That's the strange tension of real moral stories. They hold joy and loss in the same hand. In the next part, the outside world will catch up with this strange little family. Phones will start working again. A wildlife officer will return her calls. A researcher will step into that spare room and see what you've been seeing. A soulful, impossible-sounding bond between wild and domestic that might just change the way we think about animals and about ourselves. If you felt a tug of recognition in Clara's shifting routines, or seen your own experiences of unexpected love and kindness reflected in this little household, stay with them. The story is about to widen, but the heart of it, that quiet room where wild and home meet, will stay right at the center. For a little while, it felt like the world had forgotten about Clara's house. No calls, no visits, just wind, sunlight, one aging laptop, and a wild bobcat family sleeping in the spare room while a house cat kept watch. But storms pass, phone lines thaw, and sooner or later, the outside world always finds its way back in. The first sign was small enough to ignore. On the third morning after the birth, Clara's cell phone, the one that had been useless during the blizzard, buzzed weakly on the counter. One bar of service, a voicemail icon. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and tapped the screen. "Hey, Clara, it's Tom Keller." The voice of the local wildlife officer filled the quiet kitchen. "Heard that storm hit your ridge pretty hard. Just checking in. Give me a call when you get a chance." Tom wasn't the type to panic. He was steady, kind in a practical way, the sort of man who knew every rancher and washout on the county map. Clara had called him once, years before, about an injured hawk. He'd remembered her name, even after she left the clinic. She stared at the phone a moment, then glanced down the hall toward the spare room door. "How exactly," she murmured, "do you leave a voicemail that says, 'I've got 4 wild kittens in here and my house cat thinks he's their uncle'?" Still, not calling wasn't an option. That's what loyalty looks like on the human side. You keep relationships honest, especially when they involve wild animals and laws. She called him back. Tom arrived later that day in a dusty truck that rattled a bit more than it should. He stamped snow mud off his boots on the porch and tipped an invisible hat at Milo, who had taken up his usual position by the front window. "Storm treated you okay?" he asked, stepping inside. "Mostly," Clara said. "There is one thing." She told him the story in simple, careful sentences. The scraping at the door, the pregnant bobcat, the birth in the spare room. She left out some of the softer details, Milo's slow blinks, the way Bramble had let her help,
because they felt almost too delicate to put into official words. Tom listened without interrupting, leaning against the counter, arms loosely folded. When she finished, he let out a long breath.
"Well," he said slowly, "that's not in any of our training manuals." Then he did something that surprised her.
He laughed, not at her but in gentle disbelief, the way people do when life throws them a scene even the best fairy tales couldn't make up.
"Look," he said, more serious now, "you did what you had to do in the middle of a blizzard. No one's going to fault you for that."
The question is, what do we do now? He mentioned permits, rehab centers hours away, and the usual routes for injured wildlife.
But even as he spoke, he kept glancing toward the hall, like he knew this situation didn't fit neatly in any form.
"I've got a friend at the university," he added.
"Predator specialist, sharp mind, soft spot for animals. Let me run this by her."
Clara hesitated. Bringing in a scientist meant turning this private, fragile experience into something larger, more exposed. But she also knew she was in deep water now.
Bramble and her kittens needed more than one person's instincts.
"Okay," she said finally. "Let's see what she thinks."
A few days later, a small SUV with university plates bumped its way up the dirt road. Out stepped Dr.
Elena Morales, carrying a worn field bag and the kind of expression that said she'd seen a lot on paper and not nearly enough in person. In the kitchen, over mugs of coffee, Clara and Tom walked her through the story again. Elena asked precise, quiet questions. How far along Bramble had seemed, how she'd behaved during labor, how Milo had acted throughout. "You're telling me," Elena said slowly, "that a domestic cat not only tolerated a bobcat in his space, but actively helped?" Clara nodded. "He showed her the water." He stayed beside her during contractions. When one of the kittens squirmed away from the nest, he curled up to keep it warm until she could reach it. On the researcher's face, skepticism and fascination wrestled. "In the literature," Elena said, "this doesn't really exist. We have accounts of domestic animals showing empathy across species, sure. Dogs adopting kittens, cats grooming puppies. But a wild predator mother allowing a house cat near her newborns?" She shook her head softly. "That's new?" Her eyes moved to Milo, who was observing from his vantage point near the stove, tail neatly wrapped around his paws. "And he's calm with them," she added. "Not fearful, not territorial." "Honestly," Clara said, "he's braver than I am some days." They all smiled at that, the tension easing for a moment. Eventually, there was no delaying the obvious next step. "Can I see them?" Elena asked. Clara felt a flicker of protectiveness rise. That spare room had become more than a nursery. It felt, in a way that's hard to put into words, like a small, sacred space. The idea of turning it into a field site or case study felt wrong and right at the same time. Wrong because this wasn't data to her. This was lived love and emotion and fragile trust. Right, because maybe, if more people knew this was possible, it could become one of those inspirational stories that gently shifts how we see wild animals and our place alongside them. She looked at Tom. He gave a small nod, as if to say, "It's your house, your call." Clara took a breath. "Let's go slow," she said. They moved down the hall together, Milo padding ahead like a black and white escort. At the door, Clara paused and spoke softly, the way she always did before entering. "It's me," she murmured. "I've brought some friends." The room was dim, warm, and calm. Bramble lifted her head at the sound, eyes sharp but not panicked. The kittens, now a bit rounder, squirmed gently against her belly. Milo hopped up onto the bed and settled where he could see everyone. He started to purr. Elena froze in the doorway. "Oh," she whispered. Just that one syllable, filled with more feeling than any journal article could capture. From a few feet away, she watched as one tiny spotted kitten stretched, pressed its face against Milo's side, and fell back asleep. Bramble watched, too, but her ears stayed relaxed. No growl, no warning.
Tom, usually a man of few words, rubbed his jaw. "You seeing what I'm seeing?" he asked. Elena nodded, eyes shining. "This shouldn't be happening," she said quietly. "And yet, it is." Back in the kitchen, the three of them talked through the options.
Elena proposed documenting what was happening, not just because it was rare,
but because it could help others understand kindness and adaptability in predators we usually only describe with teeth and claws. "We could set up cameras," she said gently. "Non-intrusive. Record interactions, note development. There's a chance this becomes more than a local oddity."
It could be part of a conversation about how we live with wildlife in a changing world. Clara felt torn. On one hand, sharing this story more widely meant letting strangers into something that had become very personal. It risked turning a soulful, intimate experience into a viral clip or a line at a conference.
On the other hand, she thought of people like the ones she'd known at the clinic. Older folks who sat in waiting rooms with hands folded, hoping for one more day with a beloved dog.
People who watched nature documentaries at night because they couldn't get out much anymore. Men and women who had been told that at their age, life was mostly about managing loss. What if seeing a wild bobcat trust a human house and a house cat gave them a small, quiet dose of hope? A reminder that the world still holds surprises,
Even in later chapters.
"Okay," she said finally. "We document, but we do it with respect. This isn't just a project to me."
Elena nodded.
"And it shouldn't be," she said. "Science and reverence don't have to live on opposite sides of the fence."
That was a fresh perspective for Clara, who had spent years in rooms where emotion was something you swallowed to keep your hands steady.
Maybe this was her chance to blend both, the clear-eyed observation of a vet and the soft, heartwarming stories that touched something deeper. In the days that followed, a few unobtrusive cameras appeared in corners. A small notepad lived permanently on the kitchen table. Times, behaviors, and small details all started to find their way onto paper. Clara noticed something else. Being asked to describe what she was seeing made her pay even closer attention.
The way Bramble's tail twitched was a certain way before she shifted positions. The subtle signals Milo used to reassure both mother and kittens.
The tiny milestones, eyes opening, first wobbly steps that might have blurred together without someone to tell them to. Still, every time she stepped into that spare room, she felt a quiet vow inside. This stays human, not just scientific. These are lives, not just data points. If you've ever had to share something precious, a family story, a personal loss, a private place in nature, you know that tension. You want others to see the beauty you see. You just don't want it to be reduced to a headline and forgotten. In the next part of this moral story, the conversation will shift from observation to preparation. The question won't just be, what is happening here? But what happens next? An enclosure will be built.
Plans will be made to help Bramble's kittens become truly wild bobcats again, even as bonds inside that little house grow stronger.
If you'd like to keep walking alongside Clara as she navigates that narrow path between letting go and holding on, between science and sacred things, stay with us. The decisions ahead won't be simple, but they just might feel familiar to anyone who's ever had to say a loving goodbye. Letting go doesn't usually happen in one big moment. More often, it comes as a series of small choices. A fence post at a time, a shortened visit, a goodbye you practice in your heart long before you say it out loud. That's how Clara began preparing Bramble's little family for the wild again. By the time the kittens were wobbling on their feet, the spare room was starting to feel too small for all that new life. They had grown from blind, palm-sized bundles into curious, spotted explorers. They wrestled, pounced on each other's tails, and practiced tiny growls that sounded more like squeaky toys than predators. Bramble watched it all with the patient focus of a mother who knew that play was their training ground. Milo had adjusted too. He still curled nearby, still shared his warmth and his calm, but he'd begun to hang back a little when they tumbled too close. It was as if some quiet instinct told him they won't stay small forever. At the kitchen table, the grown-ups, Clara, Elena, and Tom, looked at maps and sketched ideas on scrap paper.
This can't be permanent, Elena said gently.
They're bobcats. They need room to climb, to stalk, to learn what rocks feel like under their paws, not just blankets. Tom traced a square in the air with his finger. You've got that old shed near the arroyo, he reminded Clara. Good bones. We could fence an area off, make 'em a sort of halfway house between here and out there.
The phrase stuck with her. Halfway house, between wild and home.
The work started quietly, in early mornings and late afternoons.
Clara walked out to the old shed with a notebook in her pocket, the winter light catching silver at her temples.
The building had once held tools and leftover lumber. Now, when she opened the door, dust motes turned in the air like tiny planets.
It smelled of dry wood and memories she couldn't quite place. She and Tom cleared the space first, lifting, sweeping, sorting. Her hands were not as strong as they used to be, but she found a steady rhythm, resting when she had to, pushing through when the purpose felt bigger than the ache.
They laid down fresh straw, dragged in heavy logs for climbing, and stacked flat stones for perches. Outside, they set posts and stretched wire to create a roomy enclosure that still allowed views of sky and trees and the distant line of forest. Elena walked the perimeter with a practiced eye.
They'll need places to hide, she said, places to watch without being seen. We want them to remember what it means to be cautious. It was a strange puzzle. How to build something safe that didn't feel too safe. This was not a cage meant to tame. It was a training ground meant to send them back stronger.
If you've ever helped a young person move into their own apartment, or packed up a car for someone heading off to a new job,
you might recognize the feeling, pride and dread woven together.
hope that they'll thrive, fear that something out there could hurt them.
A quiet wish that you could keep them under your roof and still give them the whole world.
Inside the house, the emotional work was happening too.
Elena gently laid out a separation plan for Milo. At first, 2 long visits a day in the new enclosure, then shorter ones, then eventually only occasional check-ins.
It broke the change into small steps, the way you might reduce calls to a grown child bit by bit as they find their own feet. We're not punishing him, she reminded Clara. We're helping them all remember who they are. Bramble is a wild mother, the kittens as independent hunters, Milo as himself, here with you.
Clara nodded, but her throat tightened.
How do you explain to a cat why you're closing a door he's always been allowed to walk through?
The first time they moved Bramble and the kittens into the new enclosure, it went more smoothly than she'd dared hope. She placed a blanket from the spare room nest inside the shed, familiar smells woven through the straw. Together they coaxed Bramble into a carrier, with gentle words and a few pieces of chicken. The kittens followed in another crate, their tiny faces pressed to the slats. Milo trotted alongside as they carried everyone across the yard, as if escorting a strange little parade. When the carriers were opened, Bramble did what wild things do. She explored. Tense at first, then more assured, she sniffed logs, tested platforms, checked corners. The kittens clung to her side. Then, slowly, curiosity pulled them outward. One of them, the boldest always, scrambled up a low log and looked back at Milo through the mesh. Milo sat on his haunches, watching with that familiar, steady gaze, tail wrapped neatly around his paws. He looked oddly proud. In that moment, Clara saw something she hadn't expected. Milo wasn't just losing family. He was graduating them. As the days passed, the rhythm changed again. Milo's visits became scheduled instead of constant. Morning and evening at first, supervised time to play and groom and share warmth. Then, once a day. Then, every other day. On the off days, he'd sit at the window of the house, watching the enclosure. His ears would prick at the sight of Bramble leading her young onto higher perches, teaching them to freeze at distant sounds, showing them how to focus on a rustle in the grass until it became either dinner or a false alarm. Clara watched, too, sometimes from the kitchen, sometimes leaning against the fence with a thermos in her hand. Each new skill the kittens learned, a clean jump, a perfect crouch, a patient wait, brought a small, surprising flicker of happiness alongside the ache. This is what we wanted, she'd tell herself.
not for them to stay, for them to be ready.
Still, there were nights when the house felt too quiet again.
Nights when she'd reach for the notebook on the table and find herself writing less about habitat ranges and more about feelings. Her own aging body, the way the seasons seemed to turn faster now. The strange sense that this wild little family had arrived not just to be saved, but to remind her she still had something to give. These weren't the kinds of notes that end up in scientific journals, but they're the ones that live in the kind of soulful moral stories people carry for the rest of their lives. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the ridgeline, painting everything in soft amber, Clara brought Milo out for one of his shorter visits. The kittens were nearly as tall as his shoulders now, sleek and muscled, eyes bright. They sniffed him, nudged him, then quickly returned to practicing their stalking games with each other. Their world had expanded. He was part of their story, but no longer the center of it. Bramble watched from a platform, tail lazily flicking. When Milo passed beneath her perch, she leaned down and, just for a heartbeat, touched her nose to the top of his head. It was not a dramatic gesture. No music swelled, no human spoke. But in that small touch, you could read a lot. Loyalty acknowledged, kindness repaid. A quiet goodbye between two creatures who had done something impossible together. Standing outside the fence, Clara felt tears slip down without fanfare. Not the wild sobbing of fresh grief, but the softer kind that comes when emotions have had time to ripen into gratitude. "We did right by them," she whispered almost to herself. "All of us." If you've ever helped someone or something grow strong enough to leave you, a child, a student, a rescued animal, you know that letting go is its own form of love. It doesn't always feel like the happy ending we're used to in fairy tales, where everyone stays in the same house forever. But in real life, some of the most heartwarming stories end with a gate opening and footsteps fading into trees. As spring edged closer, the talk around Clara's table shifted from when to how. How to choose the right day. How to open the enclosure so Bramble and her young could slip into the wild canyon beyond. How to keep track of them just enough to know they were okay without pulling them back. In the next and final part of this inspirational story, we'll stand with Clara and Milo on the morning the gate opens, and we'll sit with them through the quiet that follows. We'll see how Bramble's family lives on in the land around that little house, and in the heart of a woman who thought she was done caring, but discovered there was more kindness left in her than she'd ever guessed. If this journey has stirred memories of your own, letting go, goodbyes that hurt, but also freed someone you care about, I invite you to stay with us for the last chapter. Sometimes, the softest endings are the ones that linger the longest. In the morning, they opened the gate. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt more like a held breath. The sky over the New Mexico ridge was clear and pale, the kind of blue that makes every shadow look sharper. Frost silvered the fence line. Inside the pre-release enclosure, Bramble moved in slow circles, sensing something had changed. Her nearly grown kittens paced and paused, glancing from their mother to the canyon beyond, where the wild waited like a half-remembered song. The actual moment of release was quiet. A latch lifted, a panel swung outward. No speeches, no applause, just the soft click of metal and the long, steady exhale of a woman watching from a distance with a hand on her cat's back. Bramble tested the opening the way she'd tested Clara's doorway months before, cautious, alert, pausing long enough that you could feel every emotion rippling through her muscles. Then she stepped forward, one paw, then another into the brush. Her body seemed to lengthen as she moved, as if the land itself gave her back something she'd set aside in that spare room. One kitten followed, then the second, then the rest, each one hesitating a heartbeat less than the last. In a few moments, the enclosure was empty. The wild had taken them home. The work didn't stop there. Tracking data came in over the weeks, little dots of movement across maps on Clara's kitchen table. Bramble's collar showed her exploring the canyon, then circling back near familiar water sources, then pushing farther along ridges where deer trails crossed. It wasn't a fairy tale where every danger disappears. It was something more honest, a sign that this bobcat family was doing what bobcats are meant to do: hunting, learning, surviving without her porch light.
Each time a signal came through, there was a quiet pulse of relief in Clara's chest, a small, private happiness that had nothing to do with fireworks and everything to do with knowing the choice to let go had been an act of kindness, not abandonment. Inside the house, the changes were less obvious, but just as real. The spare room, once a den and then an empty echo, began to shift again.
Clara washed the last of the blankets, but she left the faint claw marks on the baseboard where little paws had learned to push up and stand. A small photo Elena had printed, a grainy still from the enclosure cameras showing Bramble and Milo side by side, found its place on the nightstand. The room never quite went back to what it had been before. It carried a sort of soulful afterglow, as if a chapter of a personal story was written in its walls. Milo adjusted to the new normal too. For a while, he kept his post at the window, especially at dawn and dusk, eyes scanning the tree line where the canyon began. Over time, his watching became less searching and more companionable. A habit, like checking on old friends you know are out there somewhere. He'd still chirp at a rustle in the brush or stare intently when deer slipped through, but the restless pacing eased. His loyalty hadn't vanished. It had simply found a wider circle: Clara, the house, the wild beyond. Then, one crisp autumn morning, the story gave them one last scene. The air held that early hint of winter. Cottonwood leaves rattled like paper. Milo tapped insistently at the bedroom window, claws clicking on the glass until Clara woke. Blinking away sleep, she followed his gaze. At the edge of the arroyo, standing in the clean light, was a bobcat. The spots on her coat were familiar, the broken ear tip, the easy, balanced way she held herself. Stronger now, fully wild again. Bramble didn't come closer. She didn't need to. She simply stood there for a long moment, watching the house that had once been her den. Milo watched her. Clara watched them both. No words, no dramatics. Just the thick, quiet feeling you get when life circles back in a way you never expected. After a while, Bramble turned. With a flick of her tail, she walked back into the trees. The canyon took her in, and the brush closed behind her. That was it. No guarantees. No promise she'd ever appear again. Just that single shared moment, like a heartwarming story you hold in your hands for a second, before tucking it away where it won't get lost. That's where the moral stories we love so much truly live. Not in the idea that nothing ever changes, but in the understanding that love sometimes means opening your door, and sometimes means watching from a window, or someone you care about walks away into exactly the life they were meant for. For Clara, the journey with Bramble and her kittens changed the shape of her days. She still wrote about predators, but now the pages carried more than facts. They held emotions, the way a wild mother's eyes soften when she trusts you, the gentle bravery of a house cat offering comfort, the complicated, beautiful ache of letting go. She started answering emails from strangers who'd read about her work, older folks who wrote things like, "I'm alone now too, but your story made me feel less so." Or, "I always thought animals out there were just dangerous. Now I see a little kindness in them too." Her life didn't suddenly become a fairy tale. She still had lonely evenings, still felt her knees on cold mornings, but she also had a renewed sense of purpose, using stories of bobcats and other wild neighbors to remind people that we share this earth with lives as full and soulful as our own, and that gentle stewardship matters. And maybe that's the fresh perspective this inspirational story leaves with us. True happy endings don't always look like everyone staying under the same roof. Sometimes happiness is knowing you did your part in a much bigger picture. That you answered a knock when it came. That you chose compassion in a fearful moment. That you honored the boundary between wild and home instead of trying to erase it. Sometimes the happiest thing you can do for a wild animal is to help it heal, and then step back and let the forest, the mountains, the night sky take over the rest. As you sit with Clara's story, and Milo's, and Bramble's,
Maybe take a quiet moment for yourself. Ask, where in your own life is there a door you're afraid to open, or a gate you're afraid to unlatch? Is there a part of you that has stayed safely inside for years, like Clara, convinced you're done carrying that deeply, when in truth, there's still so much kindness, loyalty, and love left in you? Or maybe there's someone or something you've helped grow strong who is ready to step into their own wild now, and you're learning to let them go with grace.
If this journey with a bobcat, a house cat, and a woman in the desert has touched something in your heart, if it's reminded you that quiet, heartwarming stories can be just as powerful as the loud ones, I'd love to invite you to stay connected. Take a second to reflect on what this story means for you. Then, if you feel comfortable, share a memory or thought in the comments.
After that, please gently tap the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Stories where nature, fairy tales, and real life meet in small, unforgettable ways. And if you'd like to go one step further, you can use the super thanks or donation options below to help us support the rescue and healing of wild animals like bobcats, the quiet, fierce neighbors who share this world with us. Every bit of support, every view, every act of kindness helps us keep telling these soulful, hopeful stories and helps more wild mothers out there in the dark find the help they need when they finally come to the door.